Hi, I'm Scott for ediblemusic.com. If you're encountering some muddiness in your mix, it will have one of two causes. Either it's a specific program element that is imbalanced, maybe it has some muffled sounds to it, and those problem areas are overtaking the clarity of the program element that you might be able to find in other parts of the frequency spectrum. These muddy frequencies are just too loud and they're covering up the rest of it. The second reason might be multiple tracks crossing over each other and producing that muddiness. Maybe it sounds okay on its own, but then once they're blended together, they're both fighting to occupy the same areas of the frequency spectrum, and they're not blending very well, so that's producing some muddiness there. I'll talk about a few causes to muddiness in your mixes that will fit into these categories so that you can locate and identify the areas that they're occurring and how to clean them out so that you're working with nice, clear tracks that will make your mixing process a lot more fun. And I'll give you the first step right now, which is if you have any processing on your mastering channel, your master bus, turn that off. Let's say you have your mix with your program tracks and your send and return channels all going into your master channel. If you have any processing on the master channel, turn it off and see if the problem goes away. It's not likely that this will solve the problem because if the master channel is producing the muddiness, then it's probably an issue with the metering of the entire mix, and you would likely have noticed all of those red meters going off all over the place. Now let's take the steps through this mix visualization, and I'll show you how to find out what's making it a muddy mix. Play the mix to yourself and try scanning your ears around the mix to hear a general area that you can estimate that problem area to be on the frequency spectrum. You can already start narrowing things down here. It's not going to be coming from the highest frequencies, but it's also not going to be coming from the lowest of the low frequencies. That's more what we would describe as rumble. Muddiness usually occurs in what we call the low mids, and that's because a lot of instruments, a lot of the program elements in your mix are probably taking up part of that frequency area. So many instruments will occupy that same zone, and so it's difficult sometimes to be able to manage them and make sure that they're interacting nicely with each other. When they're not interacting nicely with each other, that's where muddiness occurs. And that's why you go through the mix, narrowing down one at a time until you find it. So you've checked the master, now you can go through the rest of the mix one at a time. Start with the return tracks. If there's reverbs or delays or maybe some parallel compression, some parallel saturation, whatever processing you have going on your return channels, turn that off. Start with the return tracks. Maybe you have some reverbs or delays, some parallel compression perhaps, or saturation. Turn those off so that you can just hear the tracks on their own, and again, see if the problem has gone away. If the problem remains, mute the more decorative tracks, the more supplemental tracks, or the background tracks. Mute those, and one important thing to know is that there might be more than one cause to the muddiness. So as you're muting tracks going through this process, you might notice that the muddiness changes, but it doesn't go completely away. And in that case, you want to make note of the muddiness fixes that you need to make on that track, but you do want to continue the process until you've found that core problem and gotten rid of it. Starting with the master, then the return channels, then the less important tracks, the backing tracks, and then you'll end up with just the core elements of the song that you began the mix with, and hopefully those by that point will be sounding good. Give yourself this framework. You're keeping your ears focused on that area that you had estimated, that general frequency area where you're hearing the muddiness. As you're taking tracks out of the mix, you're not expecting it to sound magically amazing, right? You're not done yet, but you are just focusing on that frequency area, that problem area, and seeing if that area improves when you take a track out. You'll probably find it before you get to that skeletal core version of the mix. And when you locate that track, then you do the same thing, now only on the specific track that you've identified the problem to be on. So you start at the very end of the processing chain, Maybe there's some spatial effects on that track, saturation, compression, EQ. Take those off one at a time and see if the problem has resolved. If it does, then you know, wow, I found it. That's where the problem is. That's what I'll have to fix. If it's a reverb you have loaded on that track, it might be too loud, so try just turning it down first. Or it might be producing those muddy frequencies from the program element that's being sent into it. So you can EQ out those frequencies in the reverb so that it's more shaped around the program. It might be a balancing issue with the channel itself. You might just need to turn the channel down and that might solve it. Sometimes it does. Don't discount the volume fader. Did you turn something up too much because you wanted to hear a higher frequency area, but the lower frequencies are louder than it, so they were then turned up too much? If it's some saturation, some compression, then it might just be receiving too much signal and it's squashing all the brightness out of the sound, all the clarity out of it, and it's not giving you something that you should be able to work with. So maybe adjust the threshold. Maybe there's too much signal coming into it, so then you want to back that off, and hopefully that will fix it too. Maybe I should actually make a guide or a chart for this so that you can have this mixing map with you while you're working through this process. I'll make one and then I'll give you a link to email it to you. If you've traced your steps all the way back to these core elements of the song and it's still sounding muddy, then you might need to re-record your parts. If it's a really remarkable performance, one of those spur of the moment creative performances that you don't think can be repeated, then maybe you'll want to look into something like Isotopes RX or one of the corrective plugins that are out there. This is a key decision point that I think a lot of those who are learning how to mix make the wrong decision. Consider it in terms of time. Will it take you less time to fix it in the mix, or will it take you less time to lay down a new recording that doesn't have those problems in it? It's a practical decision. It's a time-based decision. Choose the one that will take you less time. Sounds logical, right? And if it's not a problem with the clip itself, with the recording itself, then that's great. Then we just have to work on processing. So you'll work your way forwards again, adjusting the settings for what processing you had on the channel, or adding some new processing because what you had there might be important for other reasons but isn't fixing the problem. So you might need to add another EQ in order to solve it. Leave the other ones in place because they're doing something that you need them to do. Add another EQ to resolve this specific problem. And again, remember, as you're muting one part at a time, you're not listening for the mix to magically sound perfect. You're just keeping your ears focused on that problem area and muting tracks one at a time until that problem seems to be resolved. Then taking a closer look at that track and the processing on it to see if one of those plugins or one of those processing elements might be producing the problem. And it might only go away in parts. Work your way into the song, muting one group at a time, one track at a time, and then doing the same thing at the level of the processing that's on that channel. And hopefully, from last to first, you'll have discovered what the cause of the muddiness is. So again, I'm going to make this chart, I'm going to make this guide for you. If you'd like it, there's going to be a link for you to download it, and I'll see you there.